Is this some kind of joke? The question, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the noise of the bustling flight deck. Petty Officer Third Class Evans, barely out of his teens, stood with his hands on his hips, his perfectly pressed uniform a stark contrast to the weathered civilian clothes of the old man before him. The sun glinted off the polished buckle of his belt, a small, arrogant star in the vast open air. Ralph Mercer, 89 years old, didn't respond. He simply stood by the safety railing, his gnarled hands resting on the cool gray steel. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the deep blue of the Pacific met the paler blue of the sky. He had seen this view 1,000 times, from 100 different decks, in peace and in war. The young sailor's impatience was a mosquito buzzing in his ear, an annoyance but nothing more. Evans exchanged a look with another sailor, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look, Grandpa, this is an active-duty warship, not a retirement home. The public tour is moving. You need to either keep up or get off." His voice was unnecessarily loud, drawing the attention of nearby families who were enjoying their Fleet Week tour. He took a step closer, invading the old man's space. "I need to see your visitor pass." Now, he held out his hand, palm up, demanding. The confrontation had been building for several minutes. It began with a simple, polite request from Evans to keep moving, which Ralph, lost in a memory triggered by the familiar scent of salt and jet fuel, hadn't immediately heard. Evans, tasked with crowd control and filled with the self-importance that often accompanies a new uniform, took the silence as a personal slight. He saw a frail, confused old man who was disrupting the neat, orderly flow he was supposed to maintain. He saw a problem to be solved, not a person to be respected. Ralph turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes, clouded with age but still sharp, finally landing on the young man. He didn't show anger or fear. There was just a quiet, profound weariness in his expression. He reached into the pocket of his simple windbreaker, his movements deliberate and slow. "Come on, we don't have all day," Evans snapped, his foot tapping an impatient rhythm on the non-skid surface of the deck. "Or did you forget where you put it? Maybe you forgot where you are, too." A mother with a small boy in tow paused a few feet away, her brow furrowed with concern. Other visitors slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the one-sided conflict. The small bubble of tension was growing, a pocket of discomfort on the otherwise festive deck of the aircraft carrier. The chatter around them seemed to dim, replaced by a strained silence. Ralph's hand emerged from his pocket, holding not a visitor pass but a small, worn leather wallet. The leather was cracked and faded, smoothed by decades of use. He began to open it with the same unhurried pace. This was too much for Evans. He saw the old man's slowness as defiance. He saw the growing audience as a challenge to his authority. He needed to end this, to reassert control. "I don't have time for this," he said, his voice rising. "You're creating a security issue. Either show me your pass and move along, or I'll have the master-at-arms escort you off this ship. You understand me?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, threatening whisper. "What was your rank when you were in, anyway? Cook? Supply clerk? Bet you spent your whole career peeling potatoes." The insult hung in the air, sharp and ugly. The mother nearby pulled her son a little closer. Ralph Mercer's fingers paused on the worn leather of his wallet. He said nothing. His silence was a canvas, and on it the petty officer was painting a detailed portrait of his own disrespect. Evans felt a surge of victory. He had him. The old man was intimidated, speechless. He had won. But as Ralph's fingers fumbled with the wallet, his other hand, as if by instinct, went to the breast pocket of his jacket. He touched a small, hard lump there, a subconscious gesture of reassurance. For a fleeting second, the bright, sun-drenched flight deck vanished from his mind. The air is thick with smoke and the metallic taste of fear. He's on the bridge of a destroyer, the USS Callahan, and the world outside is a hellscape of fire and water. The deck lurches violently as another explosion rocks the ship. Men are shouting. Alarms are blaring. He's a young lieutenant, barely 22, and his captain, a man whose face is illuminated by the flickering orange of the fires, is pressing a small, heavy brass object into his hand. It's a compass. "This will always point you true, Mercer," the captain yells over the din. "Not just north. True. The weight of it in his palm is the only solid thing in a world that is coming apart at the seams. It's not just a tool, it's a promise. A promise of direction in the midst of chaos." The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving the warmth of the California sun on his face. He looked at Petty Officer Evans, whose smirk was now a full-blown sneer. The crowd was larger now, a semicircle of silent, awkward witnesses. The humiliation was peaking. Ralph was no longer just an old man. He was a spectacle. The mother, Sarah, could not stand it any longer. Her son, Leo, a boy of about 8 who devoured books about naval history, looked up at her with wide, confused eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "why is that sailor being so mean? Old people were sailors too, right?" That was it. Sarah's hesitation evaporated. Confronting the arrogant young sailor would be pointless. He was drunk on his own sliver of power. She scanned the deck, her eyes searching for someone with more stripes, more authority, more common sense. She spotted him near the forward aircraft elevator, a chief petty officer, his uniform adorned with the gold anchor of his rank, observing the tours with a practiced, watchful eye. He looked like he had seen it all. She disentangled her hand from her son's. "Stay right here for 1 second, sweetie." She walked quickly, purposefully toward the chief. "Excuse me, chief," she said, her voice low but firm, not wanting to add to the spectacle. The chief turned, his expression professionally neutral. "Ma'am, that petty officer over there," she nodded back toward the scene. He's publicly harassing a very elderly visitor, a veteran, and it's getting worse. The old gentleman is being very patient, but the sailor is threatening to have him arrested or thrown off the ship." She took a breath. "I don't know who the old man is, but there's a dignity about him. It just feels wrong, deeply wrong." The chief's eyes narrowed as he looked past her, taking in the scene. He saw Evans, puffed up and aggressive. He saw the silent, uncomfortable crowd, and he saw the old man standing with a quiet stillness that was more powerful than all of Evans's bluster. A chief petty officer's job is to manage the enlisted, and his finely tuned instincts screamed that a monumental mistake was being made. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll handle it." He reached for the radio on his belt. He didn't shout, he didn't run. He just keyed the mic and spoke, his voice calm and clear. "Bridge, this is Chief O'Malley on the flight deck. We have a developing situation with a civilian guest and Petty Officer Evans. I need a member of the command staff to attend." There was a crackle of static, then a voice from the bridge. "What's the nature of the situation, Chief?" The chief looked at Ralph Mercer, who was finally pulling a worn, laminated ID card from his wallet. "The guest's name is Ralph Mercer, Mercer. The phone call was patched through from the bridge to flag plot, the nerve center of the carrier strike group, 1 level below. Rear Admiral Thompson, the commander of the entire group, was standing with the ship's captain, a man named Miller, reviewing flight schedules for an upcoming demonstration. The atmosphere was calm, professional, the quiet hum of high-tech equipment a backdrop to their conversation. A young lieutenant at a communications console turned in his chair. "Sirs, Chief O'Malley reports a personnel issue on the flight deck involving a civilian guest." Captain Miller frowned. "A personnel issue? On a public tour day? What is it?" "A petty officer is apparently in a confrontation with an elderly gentleman, sir. The name provided is Ralph Mercer." The name hung in the air for a moment, meaningless, just another name. Captain Miller was about to dismiss it as a minor disciplinary matter for the chief to handle when Admiral Thompson, a man known for his encyclopedic memory of naval history, suddenly went still. The coffee cup in his hand stopped halfway to his lips. "Mercer," Thompson said, his voice quiet. "Ralph Mercer?" He walked over to the console. "Lieutenant, run that name through the retired flag officer database. Priority search." The lieutenant's fingers flew across the keyboard. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then a file appeared on the screen. The lieutenant's jaw went slack. He stared at the monitor, his face paling. He slowly turned his head to the 2 senior officers. "Sirs," he breathed, "you need to see this." Miller and Thompson leaned in. On the screen, under a grainy black and white photo of a much younger man with startlingly intense eyes, was the service record. Mercer, Ralph, rank, Vice Admiral, retired. Awards, Navy Cross, Distinguished Service Medal 3, Silver Star 2, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart 2. Last command, Commander, U.S. 7th Fleet. A dead silence fell over flag plot. The quiet hum of the electronics suddenly seemed deafening. Captain Miller felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. A Vice Admiral, a Navy Cross recipient, a living legend, and one of his junior sailors was, at this very moment, humiliating him on the flight deck in front of hundreds of civilians. Admiral Thompson straightened up, his face a mask of cold fury. "Captain," he said, his voice dangerously low, "get your master-at-arms and a full Marine honor guard to the flight deck, on the double." He looked at the lieutenant. "Get me a bullhorn." His eyes were like chips of ice. "And get Petty Officer Evans's name. His career in the United States Navy has just come to a very abrupt end." Back on the flight deck, Petty Officer Evans was oblivious to the storm about to break over his head. He was high on the feeling of having won, of having put the old man and the gawking crowd in their place. Ralph had finally produced his visitor's pass, which Evans snatched from his hand. He glanced at it, saw the name, and handed it back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. It wasn't enough. He needed to make a final definitive statement of his authority. "Now you listen to me, Mr. Mercer," he said, pointing a finger in the old man's face. "You've caused a scene and disrupted the tour. You're a security risk. That's it. You've had your chance." He puffed out his chest, his voice ringing with false power. "You're coming with me. We're going to have a long chat down in the security office, and then we're going to escort you off federal property. Put your hands behind your back." It was the ultimate overreach, a fantasy of power played out in the harsh light of day. He actually reached for the old man's arm, intending to physically drag him away. The crowd gasped. Sarah, the mother, took an involuntary step forward, ready to scream for someone to stop this madness. But before his fingers could touch the sleeve of Ralph's jacket, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't a voice or an alarm. It was the sound of precision. Thump, 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 thump. It was the synchronized rhythmic pounding of dress shoes on steel, executed with the flawless timing that only comes from thousands of hours of drill. The crowd turned as one, their attention snapping away from the small drama. A path cleared through them as if by an invisible force. Down the center of the flight deck, moving with a purpose that was both terrifying and beautiful, came a squad of 6 Marines in full-dress blues. Their white hats were stark against the blue sky, their rifles held in perfect alignment. Behind them strode Captain Miller, the ship's commander, and Rear Admiral Thompson, his face a thundercloud. Flanking them was the ship's master-at-arms, a man who looked like he was carved from granite. They weren't walking, they were gliding, a wave of pure, concentrated authority. The boisterous energy of Fleet Week evaporated, the air crackled. Petty Officer Evans froze, his hand hovering in the air. His face, which had been flushed with arrogance, turned the color of ash. He could not comprehend what was happening. He thought for one wild, terrifying moment that this entire procession was for him, that he had committed some unknown cataclysmic error. He was right. The procession did not slow until it was 3 paces from Ralph Mercer. The Marines fanned out, forming a perfect silent perimeter. Captain Miller and Admiral Thompson stopped directly in front of Ralph, ignoring Evans so completely that he ceased to exist. For a moment there was only the sound of the wind whipping across the deck. Then, in perfect unison, the captain and the admiral snapped to attention, their bodies ramrod straight. Their right hands flew up in a salute so crisp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. "Admiral Mercer," Captain Miller said, his voice ringing with a deep, profound respect that bordered on reverence. "Welcome aboard. We are honored by your presence, sir." The title hit the air and detonated. "Admiral." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Petty Officer Evans stumbled back a step, his mouth hanging open, his mind utterly unable to process the word. He looked from the saluting flag officers to the frail old man, and back again. It was impossible. It was a dream. It was a nightmare. Admiral Thompson dropped his salute but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly, addressing the stunned onlookers, but his words were clearly meant for every sailor on that deck. "For those of you who may not be aware," he began, his voice amplified by a power that needed no bullhorn, "you are in the presence of a genuine American hero. Vice Admiral Ralph Mercer is a veteran of 3 wars. As a young lieutenant on the USS Callahan, he was awarded the Navy Cross for his valor during the Battle of Light Gulf, where he took command of the bridge after his senior officers were killed and saved his ship from sinking." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The name Leyte Gulf resonated with anyone who knew their history. "He commanded the destroyer USS Halsey with distinction off the coast of Vietnam," Thompson continued, his voice gaining strength. "He later served as the commander of the entire U.S. 7th Fleet, responsible for the lives of 50,000 sailors and Marines. This man has dedicated his entire life to the defense of his country and to the sailors under his command." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "He is owed nothing less than the absolute, unconditional respect of every single person who wears this uniform." The silence that followed was broken by a single sharp sound. An old man in a VFW cap standing in the crowd, his back bent with age, straightened up and rendered a shaky but proud salute. Then another veteran did the same. Within seconds it seemed every veteran in the crowd was standing at attention. The civilians, catching the infectious wave of emotion, broke into a spontaneous, thunderous round of applause. Sarah, the witness, had tears streaming down her face, her arm around her son, who was staring at Ralph with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He was looking at a hero from his books brought to life. Admiral Thompson let the applause wash over the deck for a moment before he turned. His gaze, now as cold and hard as forged steel, fell upon Petty Officer Evans. The young man flinched as if he had been physically struck. Thompson did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet fury in his tone was more terrifying than any shout. "Petty Officer Evans," he said, each word a perfectly enunciated indictment. "You are a disgrace. You have brought shame upon your ship, your uniform, and the sacred legacy of the United States Navy. You mistook age for weakness. You mistook quiet dignity for confusion. You failed the most basic test of a sailor, to respect those who have gone before you." He pointed toward the Master-at-Arms. "You will report to the Master-at-Arms, who will escort you to the bridge. Your conduct and your future will be reviewed. Now get out of my sight." Evans, pale and trembling, could only stammer, "Aye, sir." He turned and walked away, escorted by the Master-at-Arms, his confident swagger completely gone, replaced by the shambling gait of a man who knew his world had just ended. With the source of the conflict removed, Ralph Mercer finally spoke. He raised a hand, a gesture that was both a thank you and a dismissal of the fuss. He looked at Admiral Thompson, a man he had mentored as a young ensign decades ago. "Easy, Tom," Ralph said, his voice raspy but clear. "He's just a boy, full of more vinegar than sense. We were all like that once, before the sea taught us a little humility." He turned his gaze to the crowd, to the young faces and the old, to the sailors and the civilians. "The uniform doesn't make the person," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected strength. "It just reveals what was already there: honor, courage, respect. Those things are in your heart long before they put the stripes on your sleeve." As he spoke, his hand instinctively went to his pocket, his fingers closing around the small, heavy brass compass. The bridge of the USS Halsey is a scene of controlled chaos. A rocket-propelled grenade has struck the superstructure, and a fire is raging below. The primary navigation systems are offline. A young sailor, his face white with fear, is struggling to get a fix from the backup system. He's panicking. "I can't get a lock, Captain. The electronics are fried." Captain Ralph Mercer, his face smudged with soot, walks over to him. He doesn't shout. He places a firm, steady hand on the sailor's shoulder. "Breathe, son." He pulls the old brass compass from his pocket, the one given to him by his first captain in a different war, on a different burning ship. He holds it flat in his palm. The old ways still work. He looks from the compass to his charts, his mind a sea of calculations and instinct. "We know the way home. Now let's take our people there." The consequences for Petty Officer Evans were swift, but not what he expected. He was not discharged. Admiral Thompson and Captain Miller decided that would be too easy. Instead, he was formally reprimanded and reassigned. His new duty station was the ship's library and historical archives. For 4 hours every day, his job was to read naval history and write reports on the service records of decorated veterans, starting with the crew of the USS Callahan at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He was being forced to learn the very history he had so casually disrespected. Furthermore, Captain Miller instituted a new training program for all junior enlisted personnel aboard the carrier. It was called the Mercer Mandate, a mandatory weekly lecture series on naval heritage, focusing on the stories of unassuming heroes and the importance of showing respect to all veterans, in and out of uniform. A formal letter of apology signed by Admiral Thompson himself was delivered to Ralph Mercer's quiet suburban home. About a month later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Ralph was visiting the local Naval Aviation Museum. He stood before a restored F-4F Wildcat, the type of plane he'd seen launch from carrier decks in his youth, his mind lost in the past. A hesitant voice broke his reverie. "Sir? Admiral Mercer?" Ralph turned. It was a young man in civilian clothes, a simple polo shirt and jeans. It took him a moment to recognize the face, now stripped of its arrogant smirk and filled with a profound, painful humility. It was Evans. The young man's hands were twisting in front of him. "Sir, I just wanted to find you, to apologize, face to face." He looked down at the floor, unable to meet the old man's eyes. "What I did, it was inexcusable. I've been reading. About you, about your crew, what you all went through. I was ignorant and arrogant, and I am so sorry." Ralph looked at the former petty officer for a long moment. He saw not a villain, but a boy who had been taught a harsh and necessary lesson. He saw a flicker of potential that had been hidden beneath layers of pride. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It's not what you know that matters, son," Ralph said, his voice gentle. "It's what you're willing to learn." He then turned back to the plane and pointed a crooked finger at the engine cowling. "You know," he said, a storyteller's cadence entering his voice, "the mechanics who kept these things flying, they were the real magicians. Let me tell you about a chief named O'Rourke." And as the old admiral began to share a piece of the history he had lived, the young man who had once mocked him leaned in, listening with the rapt attention of a student who had finally and gratefully found his teacher. The stories of heroes like Vice Admiral Ralph Mercer remind us that true strength is found not in a loud voice but in a quiet heart. If this story of valor and humility moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming heroes who deserve to be remembered.